You are still worthless." My father, Winston, sneered, his voice cutting through the soft string quartet playing at our family luxury Christmas Eve gala. He adjusted his bespoke tuxedo lapels, gesturing dismissively at my simple, off-the-rack navy dress. "You are an embarrassment to the Belmont legacy, nothing but trash. I want you out of this ballroom before our investors arrive." I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, letting the cold liquid slide down my throat. Suddenly, my heavily encrypted phone buzzed loudly against the polished marble table. The speakerphone activated automatically via a preset security protocol I had engaged earlier. "Ms. Brielle," my lead banking executive announced, his crisp voice echoing across the sudden, suffocating silence of the private VIP table. "The hostile takeover of Belmont Capital is complete. Your liquid accounts now total $30 billion, awaiting your final execution order." Across the table, my brother Dalton opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the marble floor in pale, absolute shock. Before I explain exactly how I financially annihilated my arrogant family on Christmas Eve and why they were moments away from federal handcuffs, you need to understand the trap they thought they had built for me. Let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic relatives of your true worth. The biting winds of early November 2026 lashed against the towering glass facade of the Belmont Capital building in downtown Chicago. Inside, the climate control maintained a stifling, artificial warmth, a perfect mirror for the suffocating tension that permeated the corporate offices. I sat quietly in my assigned cubicle, a narrow, windowless enclosure strategically positioned just outside the grand, mahogany-paneled executive suites. I was 34 years old, yet my family treated me like an unpaid intern who was lucky to simply consume oxygen in their presence. I stared at the glowing monitor of my outdated terminal, methodically auditing a stack of tedious regulatory compliance forms. I did not type with frantic urgency. I moved with a cold, rhythmic precision, analyzing the numbers cascading down my screen. From the corner of my eye, I caught the sudden movement of a tailored silhouette. My brother, Dalton, paced out of his corner office, the sharp, aggressive click of his Italian leather shoes against the polished hardwood floor acted like a metronome for his towering arrogance. He wore a custom charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his shoulders, reeking of expensive cedar cologne and unchecked entitlement. He marched directly toward my cubicle, holding a massive stack of disorganized, dog-eared folders. He did not offer a greeting. He simply dropped the heavy files directly onto my keyboard with a loud, aggressive thud. The impact rattled my coffee mug, spilling a few dark drops onto my notepad. "Brielle, I need those quarterly summaries reconciled and filed by noon," Dalton barked, leaning over my partition to project physical dominance. "And try not to mess them up this time. Your meager salary barely justifies the square footage you consume in this office." I did not sigh. I did not glare at him. I calmly reached out, picked up the scattered folders, and tapped their edges against my desk to align the papers. "I will have them completed, Dalton," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. He scoffed, shooting a look of pure disdain at my faded gray cardigan. "You look completely pathetic. Try to stay out of sight when the clients arrive this afternoon. I cannot have them thinking we employ vagrants." He turned on his heel and strode away, disappearing back into his plush office and slamming the frosted glass door shut. I picked up a pen and began sorting the documents. They believed I was trapped in a cage of my own mediocrity. For years, Winston and Dalton had cultivated a narrative that I was the family failure. They paid me a poverty-level wage to handle their regulatory busywork, exploiting my labor while constantly parading their leased luxury cars and extravagant vacations in front of my face. They fed on my perceived weakness, using my quiet demeanor to inflate their fragile egos. They had absolutely no idea that the woman organizing their sloppy paperwork was a financial titan. A decade prior, operating from a cramped college dormitory, I engineered a high-frequency trading algorithm that identified and exploited microscopic inefficiencies in the global markets. I quietly founded Apex Quant, a shadow fund that rapidly swelled into a monolithic empire managing tens of billions in global assets. I am the sole, anonymous architect of that wealth. I chose to keep my fortune entirely hidden from my family. Money acts as an ultimate truth serum, stripping away social conditioning and revealing the absolute core of a person. I wanted to observe my father and brother without the distorting lens of my wealth. I wanted to see if they possessed even a fraction of familial loyalty or basic human decency. The results were undeniable. Their character was composed entirely of greed, malice, and hollow superiority. My emotional attachment to them had died a slow, silent death years ago, sitting in that cramped cubicle. I felt no warmth toward the men who shared my last name. I operated with the precise, calculating mindset of a forensic auditor watching a crime scene slowly unfold. Heavy footsteps interrupted my silent analysis. My father, Winston, patrolled the central corridor. He was the patriarch and CEO of Belmont Capital, a man who worshipped his own reflection. He stopped beside my cubicle, adjusting his gold cufflinks. He did not look at my face. His eyes remained fixed on the dusty surface of my computer monitor. "Posture, Brielle," Winston commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of perpetual disappointment. "You are slouching like a defeated peasant. We are Belmonts. We project power and success, even if you personally lack both." I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back in a show of immediate compliance. "Yes, Winston." Before he could deliver another critique, the glass doors of the reception area swung open. Vivienne, Dalton's wife, glided onto the floor. She carried 3 oversized shopping bags from elite European boutiques, her wrists heavy with platinum bracelets that clattered loudly as she walked. She possessed a predatory social instinct, thriving on the validation of high society and the public mockery of anyone she deemed beneath her. She spotted Winston and offered a brilliantly fake smile before her gaze shifted to me. Her smile instantly melted into a sneer of performative pity. She walked over, resting a manicured hand on the top of my cubicle wall. "Still wearing that tragic cardigan, Brielle," Vivienne sighed, shaking her perfectly styled head. "Dalton tells me you are barely making rent this month. It is honestly so sad. Having the Belmont name, but absolutely none of the pedigree or drive to back it up." Winston let out a short, dismissive breath. "She lacks the genetic ambition. Vivienne, it is a tragedy we simply have to manage." I looked up at Vivienne, locking my eyes onto hers. I did not defend my finances. I did not mention the $30 billion compounding in my offshore accounts. I simply offered a polite, vacant nod. "I hope you had a successful morning shopping, Vivienne." She rolled her eyes, bored by my lack of resistance. "Just make sure my husband gets his espresso exactly the way he likes it," she ordered, turning away to link arms with Winston as they walked toward the executive boardroom. I watched them walk away, a trio of walking billboards advertising unearned privilege and profound financial ignorance. They believed they held absolute power over my existence. They believed they could trample my boundaries without consequence. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my terminal. I opened the first folder Dalton had thrown onto my desk. I was not a heartbroken daughter seeking their validation. I was a coiled spring, gathering tension with every insult, every dismissive gesture, and every discarded file. They thought I was a silent, helpless target. They did not realize they had just handed their entire financial nervous system to the apex predator waiting patiently in the shadows. I pressed my fingertips against the rigid edges of the compliance forms Dalton had discarded on my keyboard. The brass fastener bit into my thumb as I flattened the curled paper. Black ink smeared slightly under the harsh fluorescent glare of my cubicle lamp. I grabbed a red pen and began circling the missing signatures, engaging the mundane, robotic motions of a bottom-tier clerk. My bi-weekly direct deposit hit my checking account that morning. The meager sum barely covered the rent for a cramped studio apartment located in a decaying industrial sector of the city. To complete the illusion of poverty, I wore a threadbare wool cardigan over a faded blouse, my scuffed flats tucked silently beneath the laminate desk. I ate boxed pasta for dinner. I rode the crowded city transit. I absorbed the exhausting reality of a lower-class existence, executing the performance with flawless dedication. Through the frosted glass partitions separating my desk from the executive suites, the contrast was violently stark. Belmont Capital projected an aggressive facade of elite wealth. Winston, 62 years old and obsessed with his aristocratic image, populated the firm with imported mahogany furniture and genuine leather seating. He drove a pristine, silver Bentley, a vehicle entirely leased on corporate credit. Dalton, at 32 years old, mirrored our father's hollow posturing. He marched past my cubicle, his bespoke Italian loafers striking the hardwood like a judge's gavel. He shoved his empty ceramic mug toward a junior analyst, expecting a fresh pour of premium espresso without uttering a single word of gratitude. Dalton thrived on intimidation, masking his profound lack of quantitative skill behind aggressive sales tactics and expensive tailoring. Brielle. Winston's voice boomed from the doorway of his office. He stood holding a stack of dry cleaning receipts. He flicked his wrist, sending the slips of paper fluttering onto the floor just outside my cubicle. Log those into the petty cash ledger and try not to stain them with whatever cheap coffee you drink. I stood up, stepped out of my enclosure, and knelt on the polished hardwood. I gathered the receipts, my face a mask of serene compliance. I did not glare. I did not sigh. "Right away, Winston," I replied, retreating to my desk. They flaunted their leased luxury cars and custom suits as weapons, utilizing every interaction to remind me of my inferior status. They believed my silence signaled defeat. They viewed my lack of resistance as proof of my genetic inadequacy. They saw a broken, compliant clerk, entirely dependent on their reluctant charity. They did not see the architect. 10 years ago, in the autumn of 2016, my reality looked vastly different from the narrative they constructed. I sat on a sagging twin mattress inside a cramped, poorly insulated university dormitory. The cast-iron radiator clanked incessantly, fighting to mask the rapid, rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard, while my peers attended fraternity parties and chased fleeting social validation. I wrote code. I consumed textbooks on market dynamics, game theory, and advanced calculus. I stripped away human sentiment from the financial equation. I eliminated panic, fear, and greed. In their place, I engineered a high-frequency quantitative trading algorithm. I built a digital predator capable of hunting fractional pennies across global equity exchanges, executing thousands of transactions per millisecond. It recognized only cold, hard mathematics, exploiting the invisible seams where traditional brokers hesitated. I launched the program from a modified, overclocked laptop. Initially, the algorithm captured thousands of dollars within months. The compounding interest transformed those thousands into millions. By 2020, my creation devoured institutional blind spots across international markets, ballooning into a monolithic financial leviathan. I founded Apex Quant. I secured the fund's architecture behind layers of proxy servers, shell corporations, and encrypted communication channels, rendering the founder completely anonymous. Today, the Shadow Fund manages tens of billions of dollars in global assets. I employ a small army of top-tier banking executives who operate under strict non-disclosure agreements. They never see my face. They receive directives through encrypted text and heavily modulated voice channels. They know me only as Ms. Brielle, and they execute my commands with absolute, unquestioning loyalty. I possess the capital to buy Belmont Capital 100 times over. I held the power to walk into Winston's corner office, drop an offshore bank statement onto his mahogany desk, and demand the immediate surrender of his company. I chose to keep the fortune entirely hidden. Money operates as a universal solvent. It dissolves social conditioning. burns away polite facades, and exposes the underlying structural rot of a human soul. I locked my $30 billion behind military-grade encryption keys because I required a pure, untainted environment. I wanted to study the Belmont patriarchs in their natural state. I wanted to weigh their moral currency when they believed nobody of consequence was watching. I needed to know if any genuine familial loyalty existed beneath their polished exteriors. The psychological experiment yielded horrific results. When Winston looked at me, he saw a disposable utility. He viewed my existence as a tax write-off, a receptacle for his daily frustrations. When Dalton looked at me, he saw a punching bag designed to inflate his brittle, fragile ego. They bonded over my perceived failures, utilizing my quiet endurance to validate their own fabricated supremacy. Any lingering embers of familial warmth suffocated beneath their relentless, casual cruelty. The inherent desire for a father's approval or a brother's camaraderie withered and died, leaving behind a glacial, untroubled void in my chest. I stopped operating as a daughter. I ceased existing as a sister. I cultivated the precise, calculating detachment of a forensic auditor. I monitored their daily operations not with sorrow, but with the chilling anticipation of a predator stalking an oblivious herd. I watched them scream at the janitorial staff. I documented Winston slashing health benefits for lower-level employees to fund his massive executive bonuses. I cataloged every unethical shortcut, every inflated projection, and every cruel insult. I sat in my windowless cubicle, staring at the smeared ink on the compliance forms. My pulse beat a slow, steady rhythm. The emotional ties were permanently severed. My family no longer constituted a home. They represented an active crime scene. And I sat perfectly still in the shadows, waiting patiently for the perpetrators to make their fatal misstep. The biting winds of mid-November 2026 battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Belmont Capital executive suites, a fitting backdrop for the storm gathering within the firm's digital architecture. The end-of-year compliance reports arrived at my cubicle in 4 heavy, reinforced cardboard boxes. Winston required physical printouts, a testament to his archaic understanding of modern finance. I sat beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, methodically pulling the escrow reconciliation ledgers for the 3rd quarter. I did not rely on the firm's sluggish proprietary software to process the data. The algorithmic engine I had cultivated over a decade ran perpetually in my own mind, automatically calculating risk ratios and liquidity balances as my eyes scanned the endless columns of black ink. 3 hours into the review, the rhythm broke. An anomaly materialized on page 412. It was a jagged edge in an otherwise seamless column of data, a discrepancy so massive it practically bled through the paper. I placed my red pen down. I pulled my keyboard forward and logged into the read-only terminal, navigating past the superficial summary pages to access the raw transactional matrix. I traced the origin of the anomaly. The numbers belonged to a Tier 1 holding trust, an escrow account designated for our most vulnerable, long-term clientele pension funds, retiree life savings, and generational nest eggs. I followed the digital routing threads, unwinding the knots of cross-collateralized loans. The capital had vanished, $50 million, completely excised from the corporate ecosystem. I stared at the screen, my heart maintaining its slow, glacial cadence. I analyzed the camouflage. Whoever drained the accounts attempted to mask the massive hemorrhage by generating phantom liabilities. They shifted the missing capital into an aggressive tier of high-yield corporate bonds on paper, using convoluted accounting maneuvers to balance the superficial ledgers. The execution, however, was spectacularly sloppy. The phantom bonds lacked corresponding registration numbers. The internal routing sequences pointed to a black hole. It was not the work of a sophisticated corporate syndicate. It was financial butchery, executed by someone possessing supreme arrogance but severely lacking mathematical competence. I needed to identify the epicenter of the fraud. Was this an external breach or internal treason? The answer dictated my next move. I hit the print command. The network machine whirred to life, spitting out a single sheet of paper containing the unvarnished reality of the $50 million deficit. I grabbed the warm paper. feeling the crisp texture against my fingertips. The coiled spring inside my chest compressed another fraction of an inch, gathering the raw kinetic energy of impending conflict. I stood up, smoothed the front of my faded cardigan, and walked deliberately toward Dalton's corner office. The heavy mahogany door stood ajar. I tapped my knuckles against the polished wood. Dalton stood in the center of the room, practicing his golf swing with a customized titanium putter. An empty espresso cup rested precariously on the edge of his expansive desk. He did not halt his swing when I entered. "Make it quick, Brielle," Dalton muttered, keeping his eyes locked on the synthetic putting green stretching across his floor. "I have a lunch meeting with the board in 20 minutes, and I do not have time for filing questions." I stepped deeper into the office, clutching the paper to my chest. "Dalton, I was processing the end-of-year compliance report. I found a discrepancy in the escrow reconciliation." He finally stopped. He leaned on the putter, raising an irritated eyebrow. "A discrepancy. Have you checked your addition? You tend to transpose numbers when you get overwhelmed." I stepped forward and placed the printed ledger gently onto his pristine mahogany desk. "I checked the raw matrix," I replied, keeping my voice meek and hesitant, perfectly embodying the role of the unsure subordinate. "It appears we are short. $50 million of client funds are completely missing from the primary escrow accounts. The routing numbers point to unverified corporate bonds." Dalton looked down at the paper. For exactly 3 seconds, absolute silence consumed the corner office. I watched the biological reaction unfold. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His pupils dilated. The titanium putter slipped from his grip, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic clatter. He recognized the page. He recognized the exposure. Then, the sheer terror mutated instantly into explosive, manufactured rage. A violent flush crept up his neck, staining his collar. Dalton lunged forward. He slammed both hands flat against the mahogany desktop, the impact rattling the empty espresso cup and sending a shockwave through the heavy furniture. He pushed his weight forward, leaning aggressively over the desk to cast his shadow over my smaller frame. He sought to project absolute physical dominance, utilizing intimidation to suffocate the truth. "You are losing your grip, Brielle," Dalton hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic blend of panic and fury. He deployed his favorite manipulation tactic without a second of hesitation. He locked his dark, furious eyes onto mine, desperately trying to force me to question my own reality. "You look at a spreadsheet and you see ghosts," he snarled, his breath hot and ragged. "You have absolutely no idea what you are looking at. This is high-level equity restructuring. It is Tier 1 capital relocation. The sheer audacity of you, a low-level clerk, waltzing into my office and accusing this firm of a $50 million deficit is sickening." He snatched the paper off the desk and crumpled it violently in his fist. "Your basic clerk mindset cannot comprehend the mechanisms of institutional finance," Dalton continued, raising his voice to ensure the sound penetrated the frosted glass walls. "You count paperclips. You file regulatory garbage. You do not audit my executive ledgers. You are completely paranoid. Your isolation is making you delusional." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the verbal assault. I monitored his rapid breathing, the sweat beading along his hairline, and the white-knuckle grip he maintained on the crumpled paper. He was terrified. He was the architect of the missing $50 million. Dalton took a step around the desk, invading my personal space. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Listen to me very carefully. If you ever dig into executive matters again, if you ever run another unauthorized query on my escrow accounts, I will fire you on the spot. I will drag security up here and have you thrown out onto the pavement. Do you understand me?" I did not argue. I did not present my credentials. I did not defend my sanity or my arithmetic. I engaged the precise physical performance he required. I rounded my shoulders, shrinking my posture to appear small and defeated. I lowered my head, letting my hair fall forward to mask my eyes. I shifted my weight nervously, forcing my hands to tremble just a fraction of an inch as I clasped them together. "I understand," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail. I apologized, Dalton. I must have misunderstood the routing sequences. I will not touch the executive files again. He sneered, his chest puffing out as he reclaimed his fabricated superiority. Get back to your cubicle, Brielle, and stay out of my way. I turned slowly and walked out of his office. I kept my head bowed as I navigated the polished corridor, maintaining the illusion of the terrified, submissive sister. I played the role of the broken pawn perfectly, granting him the intoxicating rush of unearned victory. The heavy frosted glass door of the compliance department clicked shut behind me. The submissive posture evaporated instantly. My spine snapped perfectly straight. The trembling in my hands ceased, replaced by rock-solid stability. I raised my head, staring at the blank wall of my cubicle. The cold, rational void in my chest flooded with the icy adrenaline of the hunt. Dalton had just confirmed his guilt. He had stolen $50 million from vulnerable clients, and he believed he had successfully intimidated the only witness into silence. He thought he had buried the threat beneath a mountain of vicious gaslighting. He had no idea he had just handed the map of his destruction to an architect. I sat down at my desk, pulling my keyboard forward. The coiled spring locked into place. My mind switched gears, stripping away the final remnants of familial tolerance and shifting directly into a lethal, predatory gear. The time for observation had concluded. The execution had officially begun. The transit train rattled against the elevated tracks, carrying me away from the pristine glass towers of the financial district and depositing me into the grit of the city's industrial periphery. I walked 3 blocks through the biting November chill, clutching my faded canvas tote bag, maintaining my fabricated identity until the very last second. I climbed 3 flights of stairs in a decaying brick walk-up. The peeling paint and the rattling cast-iron radiator in the hallway provided the perfect camouflage. I pushed my apartment door open, threw the heavy steel deadbolt, and fastened the security chain. I pulled the blackout curtains tightly across the single window, sealing out the streetlights. I dropped my threadbare wool cardigan onto a cheap thrift store chair. The submissive, terrified compliance clerk ceased to exist. I bypassed the barren living room and stepped into the second bedroom. This space held my true reality. I reached out and removed the heavy thermal cover, unveiling a customized, liquid-cooled workstation. 3 curved, ultra-high-definition monitors spanned the length of an expansive glass desk. A biometric scanner pulsed with a faint blue light. I pressed my thumb against the glass pane. The system authenticated my fingerprint instantly, booting into a heavily encrypted proprietary operating system I had engineered from scratch. The screens flared to life, casting a stark, cold light across the dark room. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, pulled the mechanical keyboard forward, and cracked my knuckles. The true investigation always occurred in absolute silence. Dalton paraded around the executive suites during the day, projecting the aura of an untouchable financial mastermind. His arrogance, however, bred profound technological complacency. He assumed high-end bespoke suits and mahogany furniture equated to corporate security. He utilized Belmont Capital's standard, commercially available network to conduct his shadow operations, trusting a basic, off-the-shelf corporate firewall to guard his treason. He severely underestimated his opponent. Months prior, during a routine server maintenance window I was assigned to monitor, I had embedded a ghost node backdoor deep within the firm's primary digital architecture. It lay completely dormant, a microscopic string of code masquerading as a harmless diagnostic tool, completely invisible to the firm's sluggish information technology department. I typed a rapid, rhythmic sequence of commands, my fingers flying across the mechanical keys. I sent the wake-up packet. The center monitor split into 4 separate terminal windows. Cascading lines of green code flooded the screens. The Belmont Capital firewall registered absolutely 0 anomalies. It perceived my intrusion as a standard internal backup protocol. I sliced through the basic security layers, bypassing the executive intrusion detection systems in exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. The corporate defenses crumbled entirely. I tunneled directly into Dalton's private executive drive. I did not browse the files. I initiated a silent, comprehensive data extraction. I cloned the raw transaction histories, the deleted drafts, the hidden offshore ledgers, and the encrypted communication logs. Gigabytes of hidden data poured into my heavily secured server. Once the progress bar hit 100%, I severed the connection, leaving 0 digital footprints behind. I vanished like a ghost. I opened the raw matrix and began the forensic dissection. The numbers spoke a brutally clear language, stripping away Dalton's aggressive posturing and Winston's elite facade. I isolated the missing $50 million. Peeling back the sloppy camouflage my brother had hastily applied, I traced the deficit backward, hunting for the catalyst that triggered the massive theft. The data painted a catastrophic portrait of my father and brother. 2 years ago, Winston and Dalton had bypassed the firm's internal risk assessment committee to heavily leverage Belmont Capital's assets on a sprawling commercial real estate venture. They gambled wildly on a speculative tech hub development on the West Coast. They purchased multiple high-rise structures, projecting massive corporate tenant acquisitions. The project collapsed spectacularly. The market shifted, interest rates spiked, and the anchor tenants withdrew their contracts. Construction halted, the structural foundations cracked, and the debt compounded exponentially. Belmont Capital hemorrhaged cash, sustaining massive, toxic losses that threatened to bankrupt the entire firm. Instead of declaring the failure, absorbing the hit, and liquidating their personal assets to save the company, Winston and Dalton chose theft. They cannibalized their own clients. They bled the primary escrow accounts funds belonging to vulnerable pensioners, generational trusts, and working-class retirees to cover their margin calls and plug the gaping holes in their sinking ship. I continued following the stolen capital, tracking the physical movement of the $50 million. Dalton fractured the massive sum into hundreds of smaller wire transfers to evade federal banking flags. The money flowed out of the Belmont accounts and washed through a commercial clearinghouse located in Delaware. He registered fake vendor invoices, pretending the outgoing transfers compensated structural engineers, legal consultants, and architectural firms that did not actually exist. From Delaware, the capital bounced again. I tracked the complex routing sequences across international borders. The money pooled together, landing solidly within the offshore accounts of a shell company operating in the Cayman Islands. I highlighted the corporate registration number of the Cayman entity and ran a background diagnostic using my Apex Quant intelligence databases. The results flashed a brilliant, glaring red across my right monitor. Dalton had not secured a premium, insulated financial vehicle to hide his stolen fortune. He purchased a cheap, off-the-shelf holding company previously flagged by international banking authorities for severe compliance violations. It was a blacklisted entity, heavily monitored by global financial regulators for suspected ties to illicit trade. My brother, in his staggering ignorance, had shoved $50 million of stolen American pension funds directly into a radioactive offshore vault. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. The fluorescent glow of the 3 monitors bathed my face in a cold, blue light. I reviewed the complete map of their crimes, starting from the disastrous real estate collapse, running through the fraudulent Delaware wash, and terminating at the blacklisted Cayman accounts. The evidence was undeniable, mathematically absolute, and legally lethal. A normal daughter might feel a crushing wave of sorrow at this discovery. A normal sister might weep, mourning the moral decay of her flesh and blood, devastated that her family had crossed the line into severe federal criminality. I stared at the glowing lines of code cascading down my screen and felt absolutely zero sorrow. The emotional void in my chest remained completely undisturbed. The men who mocked my clothing, insulted my intelligence, and treated me like a disposable asset were currently hanging themselves with a digital rope they had woven with their own hands. I was not a heartbroken relative desperately trying to salvage a shattered family. I was the apex predator, perched silently in the dark, charting the exact coordinates of my prey's inevitable destruction. The trap was no longer theoretical. I possessed their entire financial nervous system. The execution was secured. The dual monitors illuminated the dark room, casting a sterile blue light across the glass surface of my desk. I possessed the destination of the stolen capital, the blacklisted Cayman Islands shell company, but a forensic audit requires a complete anatomical map of the crime. I needed the ignition source. How did $50 million bypass the internal Treasury protocols without triggering an automated lockdown? I pivoted my focus. I directed my ghost node to penetrate the digital authorization matrix of Belmont Capital. Every outbound wire transfer over $10,000 mandated a cryptographic signature. Dalton held executive clearance. He possessed the digital keys to unlock the vault. I initiated a targeted query, pulling the release authorization logs for the fraudulent Delaware clearinghouse transactions. The database compiled the records, rendering thousands of encrypted packets into readable text. I scrolled through the output, my eyes tracking the timestamps and approval nodes. The scrolling data halted. My fingers froze over the mechanical keys. I leaned forward, closing the distance between my face and the glowing monitor. I analyzed the authorization string attached to the massive hemorrhages of client capital. The digital signature stamped at the bottom of the wire transfers did not belong to the vice president of Belmont Capital. It belonged to me, my unique employee identification number, my specific compliance clearance codes, and a perfect digital replication of my keystroke patterns anchored every single illegal transaction. The betrayal struck with the physical force of a hammer blow. Dalton did not merely siphon the funds, he hijacked my identity to execute the theft. He utilized his executive administrative access to bypass the security protocols on my workstation. He commandeered my credentials while I processed mundane regulatory paperwork just outside his frosted glass door. He forged my authorization on dozens of wire transfers, systematically moving the $50 million while painting my digital fingerprints over the crime scene. The fragmented pieces of their psychological warfare violently coalesced, forming a breathtakingly cruel mosaic. The gaslighting, the public mockery, the continuous assertions from Dalton that I was losing my grip. It was not simply petty arrogance. It was premeditated character assassination. They were meticulously constructing a narrative. The Securities and Exchange Commission mandates comprehensive audits for private equity firms at the conclusion of the fiscal year. Winston and Dalton knew the federal regulators would descend upon Belmont Capital at the end of December 2026. The auditors would inevitably discover the $50 million deficit. The regulators would trace the missing capital, follow the forged authorization logs, and land directly at my cubicle. When the federal agents demanded answers, my father and brother planned to hand them my forged digital footprint. They would present the authorities with the profile of a disgruntled, overlooked, and profoundly paranoid compliance clerk who finally snapped under the pressure of her own mediocrity. They would cite my isolated lifestyle and the fabricated, erratic behavior they had carefully documented in the corporate human resources files. They intended to cast me as a rogue employee who embezzled the pension funds and lost the money in the offshore ether. I calculated the mandatory federal sentencing guidelines for aggravated identity theft and massive wire fraud. Decades. They intended to let me rot inside a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life. They planned to sacrifice my freedom to shield their own crimes. While I languished in a federal penitentiary, stripped of my autonomy and wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, Winston and Dalton would play the role of horrified, victimized executives. They would leverage the public sympathy to quickly finalize the sale of Belmont Capital. They were currently courting an elite, anonymous buyer, desperate to liquidate the failing firm and walk away with their stolen, laundered Cayman capital completely untouched. They wanted to execute a clean exit, stepping over my incarcerated body to achieve it. A civilian would shatter. A normal sister would reach for her phone, call a defense attorney in a blind panic, or confront her family with tears of betrayal streaming down her face. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The leather creaked softly in the silent room. I inhaled a slow, measured breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. I felt zero panic. The revelation extinguished the final, microscopic spark of biological obligation tying me to the Belmont bloodline. They signed a declaration of war using my name. I accepted the terms. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and extracted a solid-state external hard drive cased in matte black titanium. I plugged the heavy braided cable into the master port of my workstation. I did not just download the forged authorization logs, I hunted the metadata. A digital signature might display a name, but the Internet Protocol address attached to the keystrokes provides an irrefutable geographical map. Dalton relied heavily on his administrative override. Assuming his executive status shielded his actions from internal scrutiny, he left massive, glowing footprints across the server. I ran a deep-level extraction on the hidden data packets. The code surrendered its secrets immediately. The timestamps of the fraudulent approvals matched the exact moments Dalton logged into his corner office terminal. The Internet Protocol addresses mirrored his specific executive machine. I pulled the raw surveillance server data, extracting the video feeds that showed Dalton physically present in his office, typing on his keyboard during the exact seconds the illicit transfers initiated. I cloned the unredacted routing histories, the unaltered network logs, and the system override commands Dalton executed to hijack my credentials. I harvested the raw data confirming Winston's digital approval on the secondary transfer nodes, proving the patriarch actively co-signed the identity theft. I dragged the massive cache of irrefutable, condemning evidence onto my encrypted hard drive. The progress bar steadily marched across my screen, a neon green executioner's blade sharpening itself in the digital darkness. I watched the bar fill, calculating the precise legal leverage I now possessed. They built a trap designed to cage me forever, completely unaware they had handed the key to the architect of their own destruction. The transfer completed with a sharp, definitive click from the computer speakers. I locked the drive, severed the ghost node connection, and pulled the titanium casing from the port. I held the heavy drive in my palm, feeling the cool metal against my skin. It contained the power to eradicate Winston and Dalton from the financial world entirely. The execution ammunition was secured. The final days of November 2026 bled into the concrete landscape of Chicago. The bitter wind stripped the trees bare, mirroring the desolation spreading through the balance sheets of Belmont Capital. Winston and Dalton strutted through the corporate corridors, fueled by the intoxicating delusion of their impending escape. They believed they controlled the board. They assumed I remained the oblivious, terrified pawn occupying the cramped cubicle outside their executive doors. They remained completely unaware that I was aggressively rewriting the rules of their game. I returned to my apartment, threw the heavy steel deadbolt, and engaged my workstation. I bypassed the standard operating system, launching a heavily encrypted peer-to-peer communication channel reserved exclusively for the uppermost echelon of Apex Quant. The center monitor rendered a stark black terminal. I typed a priority summons. 3 green connection nodes illuminated the display. My lead executives situated in Zurich, London, and Tokyo stood by, awaiting their directives. They did not speak. Strict security protocols dictated text-only transmissions over the secured network. I initiated the hostile takeover sequence. I transmitted the exact financial identifiers for Belmont Capital's toxic commercial real estate liabilities, the massive debt currently hemorrhaged value, held by a consortium of desperate regional banks practically begging to offload the failing assets. I typed my commands with ruthless precision. I ordered my executives to deploy a network of proxy firms. I instructed them to utilize tertiary holding companies in Luxembourg and Singapore to mask the purchasing origin, ensuring the paper trail vanished into the international ether. I authorized them to acquire the entirety of the Belmont Capital debt portfolio, directing them to pay a premium to expedite the immediate transfer of the promissory notes. The green nodes flashed in simultaneous acknowledgement. The transmission severed. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching the digital clock on my monitor tick forward. The global financial machinery ground into motion. My executives mobilized billions of dollars, navigating an intricate labyrinth of corporate camouflage to absorb Winston's catastrophic failures. Exactly 48 hours later, a single encrypted confirmation packet arrived in my secure inbox. The acquisition was complete. The regional banks relinquished their claims, transferring the massive, suffocating leverage to a faceless corporate entity. That entity reported directly to me. I was no longer merely a low-level compliance clerk executing data entry. I legally held the absolute primary debt of my father's sinking empire. I owned the walls of his corner office. I owned the lease on his silver Bentley. I owned the very ground he walked upon. I held the unilateral power to call the massive balloon payments at a moment's notice, an action that would force an immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. I secured the debt confirmation protocols and shifted my predatory focus toward their stolen capital. $50 million of client escrow funds sat dormant inside the blacklisted Cayman Islands shell company. Dalton believed the money rested securely behind impenetrable offshore secrecy laws. He trusted the geographical distance to shield his treason. I opened a proprietary coding environment. I possessed the administrative access to freeze the accounts instantly, but locking the funds would trigger automated banking alerts. Alerting Dalton to the breach would grant him time to manufacture a defense, hire defense attorneys, or destroy physical evidence. Panic creates chaotic, unpredictable variables. False security, however, breeds profound arrogance and fatal mistakes. I wanted my father and brother to feel the intoxicating thrill of their impending victory. I wanted them to finalize their plans, believing their escape route remained completely clear. I engineered a tracking algorithm, writing the code line by line. I designed the program as a digital beacon, a microscopic, parasitic script engineered to latch onto the specific routing numbers of the Cayman holding account. I deployed the algorithm through my ghost node, shooting the data packet across the international banking network. The beacon attached itself to the stolen $50 million in absolute silence. It did not alter the account balance. It did not disrupt the flow of the banking data. It simply monitored the vault. If Dalton attempted to move a single cent, my encrypted phone would vibrate with the exact destination routing coordinates before the transaction even cleared the international clearinghouse. I watched the telemetry data populate my left monitor. The connection held steady. The funds remained stationary, waiting for the elite anonymous buyer to finalize the Belmont Capital acquisition. Winston and Dalton intended to use this clean, laundered cash to walk away from the wreckage, leaving me to face the federal authorities. They believed they held the reins. I held the leash. With the digital architecture secured, I needed to forge the physical execution order. A federal investigation requires absolute, irrefutable evidence. I could not simply hand a government agent a flash drive and expect an immediate arrest. High-priced defense attorneys spin digital anomalies into reasonable doubt. I needed a weapon so sharp, so mathematically flawless, that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would deploy tactical units within minutes of its presentation. I activated the heavy-duty laser printer resting on the floor beside my desk. The machine whirred, pulling premium, heavy stock paper through its rollers. I printed the unredacted transaction matrices, the forged authorization logs, and the metadata extractions. I gathered the warm pages and laid them out across the expansive glass surface of my desk. I pulled a stack of color-coded indexing tabs and a thick, leather-bound presentation portfolio from my drafting drawer. I organized the destruction of my family with clinical, devastating precision. Section 1 established the escrow hemorrhage. I tabulated the exact client accounts Winston and Dalton drained, highlighting the specific dates and the original $50 million deficit in stark crimson ink. Section 2 exposed the identity theft. I placed the forged digital signatures side by side with the Internet protocol extraction logs. I used a ruler and a fine-tip pen to draw undeniable, physical lines connecting the fraudulent compliance approvals directly to the specific Internet protocol address of Dalton's corner office terminal. I included the network logs proving Winston authorized the secondary transfer nodes from his personal home router. The geographical map of their felony was inescapable. Section 3 tracked the offshore wash. I compiled the Delaware clearinghouse routing numbers, exposing the phantom vendor invoices Dalton generated to mask the theft. I attached the final wire transfer receipts terminating at the Cayman Islands Shell Company, capping the section with the international blacklisted status of the entity they utilized. I punched the heavy pages, sliding them onto the steel binding rings of the portfolio. I snapped the rings shut. The sharp metallic sound echoed in the quiet room like a prison cell locking into place. I ran my hand over the smooth leather cover. I did not construct a narrative of familial betrayal. I stripped away the emotional context entirely. I structured the evidence as a devastating federal intelligence dossier, utilizing the exact formatting and strict evidentiary standards required by elite government regulators. I placed the encrypted titanium hard drive containing the raw video surveillance footage and the cloned digital logs into a specialized sleeve attached to the inside cover of the portfolio. The physical documents provided the roadmap. The hard drive provided the undeniable verification. The execution ammunition was bound, categorized, and sealed. I closed the portfolio and slid it into a fireproof safe hidden beneath my floorboards, spinning the combination dial. The final days of November ticked away. The trap was fully weaponized. It sat patiently in the shadows, its steel jaws locked wide open. I continued to ride the crowded transit train. I continued to wear my threadbare cardigan. I continued to absorb their insults, organize their paperwork, and play the submissive, terrified clerk. They operated under the delusion of supreme control, preparing to sell their firm and sacrifice my freedom to maintain their aristocratic facade. They had absolutely no idea that I held the title to their building, a leash on their stolen fortune, and a federal indictment waiting in my hands. The board was set. I simply waited for the calendar to turn, allowing the coiled spring to compress to its absolute breaking point. Early December arrived, dragging a bitter, relentless frost across the Chicago skyline. Inside the Belmont Capital offices, the climate felt exponentially colder, despite the aggressive proliferation of fabricated holiday cheer. Junior analysts draped thick evergreen garlands over the mahogany banisters. A towering Douglas fir, dripping with imported crystal ornaments and silver ribbons, dominated the main reception area. The festive decorations clashed violently with the suffocating psychological suppression crushing the compliance department. The corporate environment mutated into a pressure cooker. Dalton escalated his demands, dumping towering stacks of physical files onto my desk mere minutes before the close of business. He weaponized his authority, forcing me to remain in the windowless cubicle long past sunset. I organized the paperwork, audited the meaningless reports, and absorbed the exhaustion without uttering a single syllable of complaint. I operated as the perfect, unquestioning subordinate, cultivating the exact environment of total domination they required. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December, the established pattern of overt hostility abruptly vanished. I sat at my terminal, inputting data from a stack of expense receipts, when heavy, measured footsteps approached my enclosure. I recognized the gate. It belonged to Winston. I braced myself for the standard barrage of insults regarding my wardrobe or my posture. Instead, a completely alien silence filled the space. I stopped typing and looked up. Winston stood at the entrance of my cubicle. He did not scowl. The perpetual lines of disappointment etched around his mouth smoothed out, replaced by a sickening, manufactured smile. He wore a tailored cashmere suit that smelled faintly of aged scotch and expensive cedar. He stepped into my cramped workspace, closing the physical distance between us. He reached out and placed his hand heavily upon my right shoulder. The gesture sent a visceral, biological warning screaming through my nervous system. Winston never initiated physical contact unless it served a specific, manipulative purpose. His fingers dug slightly into the thin wool of my faded cardigan, an imposing weight designed to anchor me in place. "Brielle," Winston began, his voice dropping into a low, soothing cadence that sounded entirely rehearsed. "You have been working incredibly hard these past few weeks. I see you sitting here, burning the midnight oil. I want you to know that your dedication does not go unnoticed." I maintained a blank expression, carefully regulating my breathing. I did not pull away from his grip. "Thank you, Winston. I am simply fulfilling my responsibilities." His smile widened, a predatory baring of teeth masquerading as paternal warmth. He squeezed my shoulder. "We are approaching a monumental transition for Belmont Capital. You know we are in final negotiations with an elite syndicate of buyers. They are stepping in to provide the capital injection we require to elevate this firm to the next echelon." He paused, letting the lie hang in the air. He framed the desperate, frantic liquidation of his sinking empire as a strategic victory. I am hosting a luxury Christmas Eve gala at the estate, Winston continued, his tone dripping with deceptive inclusion. It will be an intimate gathering of our highest-tier investors, key regulators, and the representatives of the purchasing syndicate. I want you there, Brielle. I insist upon it. I stared at his perfectly groomed silver hair, parsing the sudden invitation. Winston actively banished me from corporate social events for the entirety of my employment. He viewed my lack of designer clothing and my quiet demeanor as a stain on his aristocratic facade. He preferred to pretend I did not exist when entertaining his wealthy peers. The gala, I replied, letting a note of fabricated hesitation slip into my voice. Winston, I do not possess the appropriate attire for a formal executive event. I would not want to embarrass the family. Nonsense, he interrupted smoothly, his hand remaining firmly on my shoulder. You are a Belmont. Family unity is paramount right now. The buyers value legacy and cohesion. I need them to see us standing together, an unbroken front. You will attend. It is not a request. Brielle, it is a vital component of our success. He patted my shoulder twice, delivered a final, hollow smile, and withdrew from the cubicle. I watched his cashmere-clad back disappear down the corridor toward the executive suites. The heavy scent of his cologne lingered in the stagnant air. I turned my chair back toward my glowing monitor. The submissive hesitation vanished from my face, my mind engaged, processing the data, slicing through the sickening veneer of his paternal warmth. The architect analyzes every variable. Why mandate my presence at a highly publicized, elite gathering? Why suddenly champion family unity? The pieces of the psychological puzzle snapped together with devastating clarity. The previous evening, while monitoring the ghost node embedded in the firm's network, I intercepted an encrypted data packet originating from Winston's personal computer. The transmission lacked internal routing markers. It bypassed the corporate servers entirely, directed outward toward a secured federal domain. I had isolated the destination Internet Protocol address, the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Winston had submitted an anonymous tip. He handed the federal authorities the fabricated trail of the missing $50 million. He directed the agents toward the forged digital signatures, the manipulated compliance logs, and the phantom Delaware wire transfers. He spoon-fed the regulators the exact roadmap required to uncover the massive escrow hemorrhage, ensuring the evidence pointed directly and exclusively to my cubicle. He did not simply want me arrested, he required a spectacle. A quiet apprehension during business hours left room for corporate rumors. A discreet arrest allowed the purchasing syndicate to question the internal security of Belmont Capital, potentially jeopardizing the buyout. Winston needed a definitive, public execution to permanently cement the narrative. He orchestrated the luxury Christmas Eve gala as the stage for my demise. He invited the elite buyers and the financial regulators to witness the event firsthand. He intended for the federal tactical units to breach the ballroom doors in the middle of the celebration. He wanted the entire Chicago financial echelon to watch agents place handcuffs on the rogue, paranoid compliance clerk. In front of his investors, Winston would play the devastated patriarch. He would gasp in manufactured horror, shaking his head as he claimed he had absolutely no idea his own daughter orchestrated such a massive fraud. The public arrest would instantly absolve him and Dalton of any suspicion. The buyers would witness the firm aggressively purging its corrupt element, clearing the path for the acquisition to finalize without a shadow of institutional liability. Winston was not inviting me to a family celebration. He was walking me to the guillotine. He needed my physical body present in the ballroom to complete the ritual sacrifice. I leaned back in my chair. The sheer sociopathic perfection of his plan was almost admirable. He utilized the festive season, the promise of family unity, and the presence of elite society to build a cage from which he believed I could never escape. He assumed I possessed zero visibility into his shadow maneuvers. I slowly inhaled, pulling the sterile office air into my lungs. I reached for my keyboard. I did not draft a resignation letter. I did not attempt to flee the city. I forced my facial muscles to memorize the expression of meek, overwhelmed gratitude. I prepared to deliver the exact performance he required. I would attend his luxury Christmas Eve gala. I would wear my simple, off-the-rack navy dress. I would stand in the center of his opulent ballroom, surrounded by his towering crystal chandeliers and his arrogant peers. I would let him spring his trap. I willingly accepted his meticulously planned ambush because he possessed a fatal blind spot. He did not know that the anonymous buyer he desperately courted was his own daughter. He did not know I held the promissory notes to his toxic debt. He did not know I possessed the unredacted internet protocol logs proving he and Dalton executed the $50 million theft. He built a magnificent explosive device to destroy my life. Completely oblivious to the fact that I already held the detonator, I sat perfectly still in the shadows of my cubicle, allowing the countdown to commence. December 20th, 2026. The air inside the Belmont Capital headquarters thickened, pressing against the frosted glass partitions like a physical weight. The artificial cheer of the imported Douglas fir in the lobby clashed violently with the suffocating reality of impending destruction. I navigated the corporate floor utilizing absolute, action-driven restraint. I sat at my terminal, compiling a stack of redundant quarterly compliance reports. Vivienne strutted onto the floor, carrying a steaming cup of premium macchiato. Her heavy platinum bracelets clattered against her wrist with every step. She stopped at the edge of my cubicle, feigning interest in a hanging piece of silver garland. With a sharp, deliberate flick of her wrist, she tilted her ceramic cup. The scalding brown liquid splashed across my keyboard, pooling rapidly over the stack of finalized regulatory submissions. The ink bled instantly, ruining hours of meticulous data entry. "Oh, look at that," Vivienne drawled. Her tone carried zero remorse. She placed the half-empty cup on the very edge of my desk, leaving a dark, sticky ring on the laminate wood. My hand slipped. "Good thing your time is practically worthless. Brielle, what do they pay you? Minimum wage. You can just print them again." I did not gasp. I did not glare at her perfectly contoured face. I pulled a roll of paper towels from my bottom drawer, ripped off a section, and absorbed the spilled coffee. I wiped the plastic keys. I tossed the ruined documents into the shredder bin. My silence offered her zero friction, denying her the satisfaction of a conflict. She rolled her eyes, profoundly bored by my compliance, and walked away. An hour later, Dalton erupted from his corner office. He projected a manic, jittery euphoria, fueled by the delusion of his approaching escape. He leaned against the mahogany reception desk, speaking loudly enough for the entire compliance department to hear. "Book the Aspen Chalet for the first week of January," Dalton instructed his junior assistant, flashing a brilliant predatory smile. He shot his cuffs, revealing a heavy gold watch. "Upgrade the flight to a private charter. The final quarter closes next week, and I am expecting a massive payday. We are celebrating a new era for this firm." I continued typing on my wiped keyboard. He celebrated the $50 million currently sitting in a blacklisted Cayman Islands shell company. He planned a luxury ski trip using stolen pension funds. Completely oblivious to the digital beacon I attached to the offshore routing numbers, the sheer magnitude of his delusion compressed the spring inside my chest even further. I remained entirely silent, absorbing his bragging as kinetic fuel for the impending execution. I concluded my shift, boarded the transit train, and returned to my apartment. I engaged the heavy steel deadbolt, dropping the facade of the submissive clerk at the threshold. I bypassed the living room and booted up my encrypted workstation. The final preparations demanded flawless, mechanical execution. I opened the secure communication node to my lead executives at Apex Quant. The proxy firms operating in Luxembourg and Singapore had completed the acquisition protocols. I reviewed the digital contracts cascading across my center monitor. The promissory notes transferred successfully. Belmont Capital's toxic commercial real estate debt now rested entirely within my proprietary holding structures. I typed my final authorization. I legally executed the hostile takeover. I became the absolute owner of my father's sinking empire. I owned the mahogany desk Dalton leaned against. I owned the frosted glass partitions. I owned the very floor beneath their custom leather shoes. The transfer remained sealed under strict non-disclosure agreements, shielded from Winston and Dalton until the exact moment I chose to reveal the leverage. I pushed away from the monitors and walked to my hidden floorboard safe. I spun the combination dial, extracting the matte black titanium flash drive. The metal felt cold and heavy against my palm. This device held the unredacted Internet Protocol logs, the forged digital compliance signatures, and the surveillance footage of Dalton physically executing the federal wire fraud. It contained the absolute, irrefutable proof of their treason. I walked into my bedroom and pulled my simple, off-the-rack navy dress from its plastic dry-cleaning sheath. I retrieved a sleek, understated black evening clutch. I slid the titanium flash drive into the silk-lined interior pocket, snapping the brass clasp shut. The physical detonator was secured. I returned to my desk to perform one final reconnaissance sweep. Utilizing my Ghost Node backdoor, I accessed Winston's executive calendar and pulled the finalized digital guest list for the luxury Christmas Eve gala. I scrolled through the names, verifying the exact audience my father assembled for my public sacrifice. His arrogance defied basic logic. Winston invited the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He secured attendance confirmations from 2 deputy directors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. He populated the ballroom with the highest-ranking financial regulators in Chicago. He intended to showcase his pristine integrity by having federal agents arrest his own daughter in front of his peers and the anonymous buyers. The profound information gap between what the villains believed was happening and the catastrophic reality rushing toward them generated a highly addictive tension in my veins. Winston curated the perfect audience for his own destruction. He assembled the firing squad, completely unaware that I swapped the blindfolds. The next morning, the corporate offices hummed with frantic holiday energy. I walked into the staff break room to pour a cup of bitter black coffee. The ceramic mug warmed my hands as I stood in the shadows near the commercial espresso machine. Through the open doorway, I possessed a clear line of sight down the executive corridor. Winston and Dalton stood outside the corner office. They faced a full-length gilded mirror, making minute adjustments to their bespoke suits. Winston straightened his silk tie, patting Dalton on the shoulder with genuine, conspiratorial pride. They shared a quiet, triumphant laugh. They envisioned a future unburdened by debt, funded by stolen millions, built upon my incarcerated silence. I stood in the dim light of the break room, gripping the warm ceramic mug. I sipped the dark liquid, letting the bitter taste sharpen my focus. I watched the patriarch and the vice president of Belmont Capital smooth their lapels and check their platinum watches. I observed 2 men actively, gleefully digging their own federal graves. The countdown neared 0. December 24th, 2026. The morning of the gala fractured the Belmont Capital headquarters into 2 distinct, contrasting realities. In the main lobby, junior executives exchanged generic holiday pleasantries, packing up their desks for an early dismissal. Inside my windowless cubicle, the atmosphere felt dense, suffocating under the weight of an impending, catastrophic collision. I processed a stack of quarterly disclosures. My fingers moved rhythmically across the keyboard, inputting data with mechanical efficiency. Heavy, rapid footsteps echoed down the corridor, shattering the quiet focus of the compliance department. Dalton paraded onto the floor. He bypassed customary business attire, choosing instead to debut his gala wardrobe hours before the event commenced. He wore a newly commissioned, bespoke Italian tuxedo. The midnight blue fabric absorbed the harsh, fluorescent light, framed by razor-sharp silk lapels and a perfectly crisp white shirt. He strutted past the junior analysts, demanding their absolute attention, basking in the gravitational pull of his own perceived supremacy. He vibrated with a manic, unearned euphoria. The stolen $50 million resting in the blacklisted Cayman Islands shell company acted as a potent narcotic, flooding his nervous system with the delusion of invincibility. He believed he had outsmarted federal regulators, outmaneuvered the equity markets, and successfully engineered my permanent incarceration. Dalton halted at the edge of my cubicle. He checked his reflection in the dark glass of my powered-down secondary monitor, adjusting his bow tie with supreme satisfaction. "Look at this stitching, Brielle," Dalton boasted, shooting his cuffs to reveal heavy platinum links, hand-tailored in Milan. The fabric alone costs more than your annual rent. It pays to understand the higher mechanics of wealth. I stopped typing. I looked at the velvet jacket, noting the precise cut and the arrogant posture of the man wearing it. I did not mention the $30 billion compounding silently in my offshore algorithmic accounts. I did not mention that I could purchase the entire Milanese tailoring house with a fraction of a single day's interest. I offered a blank, accommodating nod. It looks very expensive, Dalton. His smirk widened, exposing a flash of white teeth. He turned and grabbed a towering stack of unsorted, archived client dossiers from a nearby staging cart. He lifted the heavy pile and slammed it directly onto the center of my desk. A cloud of fine paper dust billowed into the stagnant air, settling over my keyboard. "Cross-reference these accounts against the inactive ledger," Dalton ordered, his tone devoid of any familial or professional courtesy. "I want the physical files archived in the basement storage room before you leave today." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on my partition, invading my airspace to project physical dominance. "Finish the menial work before you go home to put on whatever cheap rags you plan to wear tonight. The buyers expect a cohesive family unit, but try to stay in the shadows. I do not want your poverty distracting them from my success." The psychological compression of the coiled spring reached an agonizing zenith. The sheer, concentrated audacity of his demands required a violent reaction. A civilian would throw the files back. A typical sibling would scream or hurl a coffee mug against the frosted glass. I engaged my action-driven restraint. I reached out, placing my hands flat against the rough cardboard edges of the dossiers. I aligned them into a perfect, symmetrical stack. I lowered my chin, breaking eye contact to project absolute submission. "I will have them archived before I leave, Dalton," I replied quietly. He scoffed, a short, dismissive exhalation of breath. "See that you do." He turned and strutted back toward his corner office, whistling a sharp, upbeat melody. He believed he was a mastermind, a financial untouchable ascending to the peak of the Chicago aristocracy. He lacked the basic situational awareness to realize the quiet woman organizing his paperwork currently held the absolute power to erase his identity, evaporate his wealth, and strip away his freedom before the clock struck midnight. I spent the next 3 hours executing his punitive assignment. I carried heavy, dust-covered boxes down to the subterranean concrete storage facility. I filed the inactive accounts into the rusted metal cabinets. I played the role of the broken, compliant beast of burden to absolute perfection. I granted him the illusion of total domination, allowing his arrogance to blind him to the crosshairs currently resting directly over his chest. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the corporate offices emptied. I boarded the transit train, the rhythmic clatter of the steel wheels matching the steady. Cold anticipation pooling in my veins, I returned to my cramped studio apartment and threw the heavy steel deadbolt. The time for observation expired. The execution phase commenced. I walked into my bedroom and unzipped the plastic dry cleaning sheath hanging from the closet door. I extracted the simple, off-the-rack navy dress. It lacked the intricate beading or imported silk favored by Vivienne and the Belmont social circle. It served as a tactical uniform, designed to render me visually insignificant, allowing me to maneuver through the ballroom completely undetected. I laid the garment flat across my mattress, packing my evening essentials with deliberate precision. I picked up my sleek black evening clutch. I unclasped the brass hardware, opening the silk-lined interior. I walked over to my hidden floorboard safe, spun the dial, and retrieved the matte black titanium flash drive. I held the small device between my thumb and index finger. It weighed mere ounces, yet it contained a catastrophic payload: the unredacted internet protocol logs, the forged digital compliance signatures, the security surveillance footage of Dalton executing the federal wire fraud from his corner office terminal. This metal casing held the mechanism to completely sever the Belmont patriarchs from society. I slid the drive into the interior pocket of the clutch and snapped the brass hardware shut. I stepped into the shower, letting the scalding water strip away the dust of the basement storage room. I dried off and pulled the navy dress over my shoulders, smoothing the unadorned fabric. I pulled my hair back into a severe, utilitarian knot at the base of my neck. I applied zero makeup, refusing to paint a mask for an audience I intended to destroy. I looked into the cracked bathroom mirror. I did not see a victim. I saw an architect preparing to detonate a building she had rigged with explosives weeks prior. Dalton stood in his corner office, drinking premium espresso and admiring his bespoke tuxedo. Winston finalized his anonymous tips to the federal authorities, preparing to sacrifice my life to salvage his fraudulent legacy. They engineered a magnificent, elaborate trap, counting down the hours until they could spring it upon me. I picked up the black clutch, feeling the solid weight of the titanium drive against my palm. The countdown neared 0. I walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind me, and headed toward the darkest, most satisfying night of my existence. The evening of the 24th of December plunged Chicago into a deep, biting freeze. I stepped out of a generic municipal taxi at the base of the Belmont Estate's sprawling wrought iron gates. I did not utilize the complimentary valet service. I walked up the sweeping, half-mile gravel driveway, allowing the frigid wind to bite at my exposed skin. The cold sharpened my focus, stripping away the final remnants of mundane office life and anchoring me firmly in the present execution. The Belmont estate loomed ahead, a colossal limestone mansion designed to project generational supremacy. Winston utilized the firm's credit lines to fund this architectural monstrosity, pouring millions into imported marble and vine terraces while his client escrow accounts bled dry. I approached the towering double oak doors. 2 private security contractors, dressed in sharp black suits with earpieces coiled behind their necks, pulled the heavy brass handles. I stepped over the threshold, trading the freezing night air for a wall of stifling, perfumed heat. The grand ballroom operated as a masterclass in aggressive, weaponized opulence. Winston spared absolutely zero expense for his manufactured triumph. 3 massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted, frescoed ceilings cast a brilliant, fractured light across the cavernous room. In the center of the space, a towering swan carved entirely from a single block of ice slowly dripped condensation onto a bed of imported orchids. Immaculate waiters in crisp white gloves circulated with alarming speed, balancing silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and beluga caviar. The room hummed with the syncopated chatter of Chicago's financial elite. Hedge fund managers, corporate litigators, and banking executives populated the floor, their bespoke tuxedos and diamond-encrusted collars reflecting the blinding chandelier light. They congregated in tight, exclusionary circles, trading hollow compliments and inflated portfolio metrics. I stepped fully into the ballroom. My attire served as a deliberate, jarring contrast to the sea of designer gowns and dripping jewels. I wore the simple, unadorned navy dress. It lacked any reflective beading, intricate lacework, or plunging hemlines. I carried no jewelry. My hair remained pulled back in a severe, utilitarian knot. I appeared exactly as Winston intended me to appear, the impoverished, irrelevant relative, a dark smudge against his gilded canvas. I did not hug the walls. I walked directly through the center of the crowd, my posture perfectly rigid, my footsteps silent against the polished marble floor. Within seconds, the predator spotted the anomaly. Vivienne detached herself from a cluster of high society wives near the ice sculpture. She wore a cascading gown of crimson silk, the fabric trailing heavily behind her, practically sweeping the marble. A diamond choker gripped her throat, catching the light like a beacon of stolen wealth. She held a crystal champagne flute in her right hand, her heavy platinum bracelets clattering together as she marched directly into my path. She stopped, forcing me to halt my forward momentum. 3 of her sycophantic friends flanked her, their eyes raking over my unadorned navy dress with undisguised contempt. "Brielle," Vivienne projected her voice, intentionally raising the volume to cut through the ambient jazz playing from the string quartet in the corner. Several nearby executives paused their conversations, turning their heads to observe the spectacle. Vivienne took a deliberate step forward, looking me up and down with an exaggerated, theatrical grimace. "Winston mentioned you were attending, but I honestly assumed you would decline. I cannot imagine possessing the sheer audacity to walk into a room like this wearing whatever that is." She gestured toward my dress with her champagne flute, splashing a single drop of the vintage liquid onto the floor near my shoes. Her friends erupted into a chorus of sharp, cruel giggles. "Did you purchase that off a clearance rack?" Vivian continued, her voice dripping with venomous delight. "Or did Dalton finally let you raid the lost and found bin at the corporate gym? You realize the buyers are arriving soon, correct? You look like a caterer who got lost on the way to the kitchen." I stood perfectly still. I did not drop my gaze to the floor. I did not flush with embarrassment. I felt my pulse maintain a steady, resting rhythm of 60 beats per minute. I looked at the diamond choker gripping her neck. I looked at the platinum bracelets. I analyzed the exact material value of the jewelry she wore, knowing with absolute, mathematical certainty that every single carat was financed by the toxic debt I currently owned. She was a hollow mannequin draped in stolen assets, mocking the woman holding the repossession orders. I did not offer a defense. I did not issue a witty rebuttal. Engaging her required acknowledging her power, a power she completely lacked. I simply stared at her face for 3 seconds, rendering her cruel laughter completely useless against an unyielding wall of silence. Then, I stepped sideways, bypassing her entirely. I left her standing in the middle of her sycophants, her mouth slightly open, deprived of the emotional reaction she desperately craved. I continued my march across the ballroom, shifting my focus from the irrelevant socialites to the tactical geography of the room. The architect must always map the detonation site. I scanned the vaulted ceilings, identifying the small black domes of the security cameras nestled within the plaster molding. I traced their firing arcs, noting the blind spots near the draped velvet curtains. I located the primary exits, the massive double oak doors at the front of the hall, and 2 secondary service doors flanking the catering kitchen. I measured the distance from the center of the room to the primary entrance. When the tactical units breached those oak doors, the crowd would instinctively scatter toward the perimeter. I needed an unobstructed line of sight. I needed the high ground. I spotted the VIP section positioned on a slightly elevated dais at the far end of the ballroom. A long rectangular table draped in heavy black linen dominated the platform. Reserved placards crafted from thick cardstock indicated seating for the Belmont patriarchs, their elite anonymous buyers, and the regional financial regulators Winston had so arrogantly invited. I ascended the 3 shallow stairs and approached the table. The atmosphere on the dais felt suffocatingly tense, a localized pressure system building independently of the festive crowd below. Winston stood near the edge of the platform, gripping a tumbler of scotch. He was not mingling. His eyes darted repeatedly toward the heavy oak entrance doors. He checked the face of his platinum watch, his jaw clenching with suppressed, frantic anticipation. He was waiting for the federal agents to arrive. He was counting down the minutes until his anonymous tip bore fruit. I walked to the far end of the table and pulled out a heavy, high-backed leather chair. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my navy dress. I placed my black clutch squarely on the linen tablecloth, resting my hands lightly over the brass clasp. The titanium flash drive rested inside, a physical weight anchoring me to the impending execution. Winston noticed my arrival. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto my plain dress. A fleeting shadow of disgust crossed his features, instantly replaced by a cold, predatory satisfaction. He viewed my presence as the final piece of his puzzle, locking into place. The sacrificial lamb had seated herself upon the altar. I broke eye contact, reaching into the pocket of my dress to extract my heavily encrypted smartphone. I placed the device flat on the table, shielding the screen from peripheral viewing angles. I bypassed the biometric lock and launched the proprietary tracking software linked to my GhostNode servers. The screen rendered a digitized map of the greater Chicago metropolitan area. I did not track the stolen offshore funds. I tracked the mobilization of the federal authorities. Hours prior, I had intercepted the dispatch routing numbers triggered by Winston's anonymous tip. I embedded a passive monitoring script into the regional law enforcement dispatch logs. A cluster of distinct red icons pulsed brightly against the dark grid of my screen. The Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical units were mobile. A convoy of armored vehicles carrying the White-Collar Crime Division and armed enforcement officers navigated the freezing, congested streets of the city. I watched the red icons advance along the digital highway. I calculated their speed and their current trajectory. They were exactly 3 miles away. Winston mobilized a federal strike force, believing they marched toward the ballroom to arrest a paranoid, rogue compliance clerk. He orchestrated this entire aggressive, opulent spectacle to serve as the backdrop for my demise. He poured vintage champagne and erected ice sculptures to celebrate his successful evasion of justice. He had absolutely no idea that the tactical convoy speeding toward his estate possessed a completely different objective. They were driving straight into my counter ambush. I locked my phone screen and slid the device back into my pocket. I leaned back against the leather chair, staring out over the sea of Chicago's financial elite. The string quartet shifted into a rapid, building crescendo. The chandeliers cast a fractured, brilliant light over the oblivious crowd. The board was perfectly arranged. I rested my hands on my black clutch and waited for my father to trigger the trap. The string quartet ceased playing. The sudden absence of the frantic, sweeping violins created a vacuum within the cavernous ballroom, pulling the ambient chatter of the Chicago financial elite down to a hushed, expectant murmur. At the far end of the grand hall, Winston detached himself from a cluster of hedge fund managers. He smoothed the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo and strode toward the raised mahogany podium positioned directly beneath the central crystal chandelier. He moved with the practiced, deliberate stride of a monarch ascending his throne. He relished the spotlight, drawing energy from the hundreds of eyes tracking his ascent. He reached the podium and grasped the edges of the polished wood. He leaned forward, tapping a manicured index finger against the head of the silver microphone. A sharp, resonant thud echoed through the towering surround sound speakers, slicing through the remaining conversations. The guests turned, forming a synchronized sea of tailored suits and designer gowns orienting toward the patriarch. Waiters froze in place, balancing silver trays of vintage champagne against their chests. The massive swan carved from ice dripped a single drop of water onto a bed of imported orchids, the only sound remaining in the vast, stifling space. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and esteemed partners. Winston began, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone amplified to vibrate against the frescoed ceilings. Welcome to the Belmont estate. Tonight, we gather on the eve of a monumental transition. I sat at the secluded VIP table, resting my hands lightly on my lap, my posture perfectly rigid. I watched my father orchestrate his performance. He projected the ultimate illusion of supremacy, utilizing the stage to cast a spell over the very regulators he intended to deceive. For 3 generations, Belmont Capital has stood as an unshakable pillar within the global financial community. Winston boomed, his chest expanding with manufactured pride. We navigate the tempestuous currents of the market not with reckless speculation, but with an ironclad adherence to our core principles. We champion structural integrity. We demand total accountability. We build wealth upon a foundation of unyielding moral fortitude. The hypocrisy hung in the air, dense and suffocating. The man pontificating about moral fortitude spent the previous month draining $50 million from vulnerable pensioner escrow accounts. He forged his own daughter's digital signature to mask his treason. Yet, the audience absorbed his words with rapt attention. Elite litigators and banking executives nodded in synchronized approval, entirely blind to the rot festering beneath the limestone walls of the estate. Dalton stood a few yards to the left of the podium, his arms crossed over his chest. He beamed, a predatory smirk twisting his lips as he surveyed the crowd. He drank the adulation, high on the stolen millions resting in his blacklisted Cayman Islands shell company. We weather the storms, Winston continued, raising a hand to gesture across the ballroom. And we emerge stronger, forging alliances with those who recognize the intrinsic, enduring value of the Belmont legacy. Tonight, we celebrate the future. We celebrate the preservation of our pristine standard. The crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. The sound washed over the room like a dry wave. Winston allowed the ovation to linger, bowing his head slightly in a pantomime of humble gratitude. Then, the performance shifted. Winston raised his hands, palms facing outward, signaling for silence. The applause died instantly. The atmosphere in the ballroom plummeted, the festive warmth evaporating as the patriarch altered his posture. He gripped the edges of the podium tighter, his knuckles turning white. He lowered his chin, casting his eyes downward to manufacture an expression of profound, heavy sorrow. "However," Winston murmured, his voice dropping into a solemn, grieving register. He leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring the intimate tone reached every corner of the silent hall. The preservation of a pristine standard requires difficult decisions. It demands vigilance. He paused, letting a heavy, calculated breath escape his lips. "A tree cannot thrive if a branch succumbs to disease," Winston stated, his words slow and measured. "To protect the integrity of the whole, one must possess the fortitude to cut out the rot. We must identify and remove the rogue elements that threaten the honor of the family name, regardless of how painful that extraction might be." The crowd stiffened. The vague, corporate boasting had abruptly morphed into a public execution. The elite attendees recognized the shift in the wind. Winston was laying the psychological groundwork, planting the seeds of suspicion right before he triggered his anonymous tip to the federal authorities. He needed these high-ranking financial regulators to hear his condemnation before the tactical units breached the doors. Winston lifted his head. He scanned the sea of faces, his gaze sweeping over the crowd like a searchlight. He locked his eyes directly onto mine. I sat at the elevated VIP table, a solitary figure draped in a simple, off-the-rack navy dress. I did not avert my gaze. I met his stare with absolute glacial calm. The entire ballroom followed his line of sight. Hundreds of heads pivoted in unison. The sea of Chicago's financial elite parted, creating an unobstructed visual corridor between the podium and my chair. Suddenly, I became the focal point of the cavernous room. The intense, unblinking scrutiny of the city's most powerful individuals slammed into me. They saw a woman devoid of diamonds, devoid of designer silk, sitting entirely isolated. They absorbed Winston's narrative, mapping his words about disease and rogue elements directly onto my unadorned frame. The psychological suppression compressed to its absolute maximum. The silent, collective judgment of the crowd served as the anvil. My father served as the hammer. Winston released the podium. He descended the 3 shallow wooden stairs, his bespoke tuxedo shifting flawlessly around his frame. He walked slowly across the polished marble floor, navigating the open corridor the crowd provided. Dalton's smirk widened into a malicious, teeth-baring grin. He shifted his weight, turning his body to fully observe the impending slaughter. Vivian, standing near the ice sculpture, raised her crystal champagne flute to her lips, her eyes glittering with venomous delight. Winston ascended the steps of the VIP dais. He approached the long, black linen-draped table. 2 representatives from a major regional banking syndicate sat mere feet away from me. They leaned in, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and sheer, voyeuristic curiosity. Winston needed them to witness this interaction. He required witnesses to his decisive, patriarchal command to cement my exile from the firm right before the sirens began to wail. He stopped directly in front of my chair. He planted his hands on the surface of the marble table. Leaning his upper body forward, he closed the physical distance, invading my space, casting a shadow over my face. The room remained dead silent. The string quartet held their bows suspended above their instruments. Winston leaned his head down, bringing his mouth within inches of my ear. He spoke in a harsh, guttural whisper, modulating his volume perfectly. He ensured his voice remained low enough to simulate a private family dispute, yet loud enough for the banking representatives and the nearby regulators to capture every single syllable. "You are still worthless," Winston sneered, the smell of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke rolling off his breath. He stared into my eyes, searching for a fracture, hunting for a single tear of validation. He found a sheer, impenetrable wall of ice. "You are an embarrassment to the Belmont legacy," he continued, his tone dripping with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "Nothing but trash. I want you out of this ballroom before our investors arrive." The words struck the air like physical blows. He delivered the final strike of his psychological warfare. He established the narrative of my banishment, perfectly timing his cruelty to precede the arrival of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He believed he had cornered a terrified, paranoid compliance clerk. He believed he had successfully orchestrated my public destruction, securing his stolen millions and his pristine reputation in one masterful stroke. Winston straightened his spine, pulling away from the table. He shot a look of profound disgust at my navy dress, turned on his heel, and began walking back toward Dalton. I did not gasp. I did not stand up and flee the dais. I did not bow my head in shame. I remained seated in the heavy leather chair. I reached forward with a slow, deliberate motion. I gripped the cold, condensation-slicked stem of my water glass. The ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal rim, a tiny, sharp sound that anchored me entirely to the present second. The pressure inside the ballroom hit its apex, the coiled spring locked into its final, agonizing position. The audience of elite regulators and sycophantic executives stared at me, waiting for the broken daughter to crumble under the weight of the patriarch's command. I sat perfectly still. I gripped the cold glass, my eyes tracking my father's retreating back. I calculated the distance between the armored federal vehicles and the limestone gates of the estate. The trap was sprung. The board was locked. I simply inhaled a slow, measured breath, waiting for the timer to hit 0. The oppressive silence anchored itself to the mahogany dais, a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the Chicago elite. Winston's footsteps echoed against the polished marble, marking a retreat from my chair. He rejoined Dalton, their shoulders brushing in a display of triumphant, patriarchal solidarity. Dalton raised his crystal champagne flute, tipping the rim toward me in a mocking, silent salute. He bared his teeth, his smirk carving deep, arrogant lines into his face. He savored the spectacle of my public banishment. Intoxicated by the stolen $50 million he believed rested safely in a blacklisted Caribbean vault. The banking representatives seated mere feet away shifted uncomfortably in their heavy leather chairs. They averted their eyes, staring intently at their folded linen napkins, complicit in the humiliation of a woman they deemed an irrelevant clerk. The towering, vine-twined chandeliers cast long, jagged shadows across the VIP table. The ambient hum of the ballroom remained suspended, trapped within the vacuum my father created. Hundreds of eyes bored into my simple navy dress, waiting for the inevitable fracture. I did not fracture. I released the cold, condensation-slicked stem of my water glass. A sharp, synthetic buzz sliced through the heavy atmosphere. The sound originated from the pocket of my dress. It was not a standard, melodic ringtone. It was the harsh, piercing vibration of my encrypted device overriding its silent protocols, signaling a Priority 1 transmission from my shadow servers. The sudden noise startled the nearby regulators. A regional director seated to my left flinched, knocking his elbow against his silverware. A drop of burgundy wine spilled onto the pristine tablecloth, blooming like a fresh bruise across the white linen. Winston halted his victory march. He turned his head, his brow furrowing in deep, patrician annoyance at the disruption. Dalton lowered his flute, his smirk faltering as his eyes locked onto my pocket. I reached into the fabric folds and extracted the black metal device. The screen pulsed with a stark, blinding white light. I did not reach to mute the alert. I did not apologize for the interruption. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I placed the phone flat onto the center of the linen-draped table. I swiped my thumb across the biometric sensor, unlocking the hardware, and tapped the audio output icon. The speakerphone engaged. The connection lacked any static or ambient interference. The transmission carried the clinical, acoustic perfection of military-grade encryption. "Ms. Brielle," my lead banking executive announced, his crisp, European accent resonated through the speaker. carrying absolute, unquestioning deference. The voice echoed off the marble pillars, projecting loud enough to reach the front rows of the gathered elite. Winston stiffened, his spine locked into a rigid, paralyzed column. "The hostile takeover of Belmont Capital is complete," the executive continued, delivering the words with the devastating force of a kinetic strike. "Your liquid accounts now total $30 billion, awaiting your final execution order." The transmission severed. A heavy, ringing silence washed over the dais. The information gap slammed shut with violent, catastrophic momentum. Dalton's jaw unhinged. The muscles in his hand failed entirely, stripped of their motor function by sheer, paralyzing shock. The crystal flute slipped through his trembling fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the polished marble with a violent, explosive crash. Shards of expensive glass sprayed across the dais, catching the chandelier light like scattered diamonds. The vintage champagne pooled around his bespoke Italian loafers, staining the pristine leather. He did not look down at the ruined shoes. He stared at the black phone resting on the table, his pupils dilated to their absolute maximum. He attempted to pull oxygen into his lungs, but his chest simply heaved in rapid, shallow spasms. He stumbled a half-step backward, his heel crunching over the broken crystal. He gripped the edge of a nearby mahogany chair to keep his legs from collapsing beneath his weight. Winston transformed into a limestone statue. The flush of patriarchal victory evaporated from his cheeks in a single heartbeat, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The intricate network of veins on his forehead bulged against his temples. He stared at me, his mind desperately rejecting the mathematical impossibility crashing down upon his empire. He heard the name of his company. He heard the staggering, monolithic sum. He realized the anonymous titan he spent the entire month courting for a financial bailout was the very woman he just ordered out of his ballroom. Across the room, Vivian stood near the ice sculpture. Her cruel, mocking laughter died in her throat. The acoustics of the ballroom carried the crisp voice of my executive directly to her location. She clutched her diamond choker, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The socialite realized the platinum bracelets weighing down her wrists were financed by a man who no longer owned his own desk. I reached forward and pressed the power button, plunging the device back into darkness. I slid the phone into my pocket, securing the technology. I placed my palms flat against the edge of the mahogany table. I pushed my heavy leather chair backward. The wooden legs scraped against the dais, a harsh, grating sound that broke the paralysis gripping the VIP section. I stood up slowly, rising to my full height. The submissive, terrified compliance clerk vanished entirely. The physical manifestation of my fabricated identity evaporated into the stifling ballroom heat. I pulled my shoulders back, elevating my chin to look down upon the men who spent decades trying to convince me I was nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or demand their respect. I did not need to hurl insults to establish dominance. I radiated a lethal, untouchable authority, filling the vacuum Winston created with a crushing, apex presence. The energy in the room coalesced around me, shifting the gravitational pull of the entire estate. I looked directly into Winston's eyes. The patriarch who commanded the Chicago financial elite was currently shrinking inside his cashmere tuxedo. He saw the cold, rational void in my gaze. He saw the forensic auditor who mapped his crimes. He saw the $30 billion standing behind my simple, unadorned navy dress. The elite regulators and banking syndicates seated at the table stared at me in profound, unmitigated awe. The regional director wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, his hands shaking visibly. They recognized the power dynamic violently reversing itself in front of their eyes. They realized the woman they ignored possessed the capital to buy their respective institutions 10 times over. Dalton clawed at his silk tie, pulling the knot loose in a desperate bid to breathe. The arrogant vice president realized his stolen $50 million meant absolutely nothing against the Leviathan I commanded. His bespoke suit offered zero armor against the reality of his impending destruction. I held the silence, weaponizing it against them. I allowed the sheer magnitude of their miscalculation to crush their lungs. I watched the realization dawn on their pale faces. They built a cage of psychological abuse, assuming they trapped a defenseless, inferior pawn. They realized, in that exact second, they had locked themselves inside a vault with an executioner. The guests on the main floor remained frozen. Waiters held their breath. The magnificent trap my father engineered to destroy my life now served as the perfect, illuminated stage for my ascension. He gathered the city's highest-ranking regulators to watch a compliance clerk fall. Instead, he forced them to witness the birth of a financial titan. I did not need to wait for the federal authorities to strip him of his power. I already possessed his corporate crown. I held it in my hands, and I prepared to crush it into dust. I broke the paralysis gripping the dais. I reached down, grasping the brass clasp of my oversized, black leather envelope clutch. I snapped the hardware open. The sharp metallic click severed the absolute silence hanging over the VIP table. I slid my hand into the silk-lined interior, wrapping my fingers around the thick, leather-bound forensic portfolio I had compressed within the compartment. I pulled the dense document free. I lifted the heavy binder and dropped it squarely onto the center of the polished marble table. The heavy leather and thick stacks of premium paper struck the stone surface. The resulting dull, resounding thud echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a physical hammer blow that shattered their remaining delusions. The sheer weight of the portfolio signaled catastrophic exposure. The regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, seated just 2 chairs away, jolted backward in his seat, his eyes locked instantly onto the crimson and black indexing tabs protruding from the binding. He recognized the strict evidentiary formatting of a federal intelligence dossier. "Dalton," I stated. My voice lacked any trace of the timid compliance clerk. I spoke with the icy, mechanical precision of a quantitative algorithm executing a liquidation protocol. On the 12th of November, 2026, you initiated the first unauthorized wire transfer. You bypassed internal treasury controls to siphon $50 million from our Tier 1 client escrow trusts. Dalton attempted to shake his head. A pathetic, jerky tremor wrecked his neck muscles. He could not formulate a single syllable of denial. His mouth hung open, dragging in empty air. You routed the stolen capital through a Delaware clearinghouse using fabricated vendor invoices. I continued relentlessly, dissecting the fraud layer by layer. You funneled the stolen pension funds across international borders. The capital terminated in the Cayman Islands. Corporate registration number 87429-Alpha. I recited the digits flawlessly, stripping away his offshore camouflage. A shell company currently blacklisted by global financial authorities for severe illicit trade violations, I added. The banking syndicate representatives murmured in collective horror. The word blacklisted operated as a lethal toxin in their environment. They practically scrambled to push their heavy mahogany chairs away from the Belmont patriarchs, physically distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout spreading across the table. "You did not utilize your executive clearance to move the money," I declared, my gaze slicing through Dalton's mounting panic. "You hijacked my compliance credentials. You forged my digital authorization." I reached forward and flipped the heavy leather cover of the portfolio open. The first page displayed the unredacted surveillance logs and the Internet Protocol extraction data. I tapped my index finger against the stark crimson ink, anchoring their treason to the physical page. "Timestamp 2:14 in the morning," I recited, my tone unwavering. "Internet protocol address 192.168.0.4. That is the dedicated network line for your private home router, Dalton. You executed the identity theft from your own living room. You left a digital footprint massive enough to secure a 40-year federal prison sentence." The remaining oxygen evacuated Dalton's lungs. He staggered backward, his knees buckling entirely. His bespoke Italian loafers scraped clumsily against the polished marble floor, losing all traction. He clawed at his throat, his manicured fingers tearing violently at the knot of his silk tie. He ripped the collar of his crisp white shirt open, desperate to force air into his seizing chest. The stolen $50 million offered zero insulation against the sheer, crushing weight of the federal evidence resting on the table. He collapsed heavily into the nearest chair. He hyperventilated, his torso heaving in rapid, uncontrollable spasms. Sweat poured down his temples, ruining his perfectly styled hair and staining the collar of his expensive tuxedo jacket. He stared at the color-coded pages, trapped in the inescapable reality of his own destruction. Winston watched his son disintegrate. The patriarch of Belmont Capital realized the absolute scope of the exposure. The federal regulators seated inches away absorbed every single word of the confession, turning their heads to stare at the man who had just preached about moral fortitude. Winston abandoned his aristocratic posture. The facade of the untouchable chief executive melted into a puddle of frantic desperation. He leaned heavily across the marble table, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the stone edge. He lowered his voice to a frantic, raspy whisper, desperately attempting to salvage the wreckage of his empire before the authorities breached the ballroom doors. "Brielle," Winston pleaded. Sweat pooled in the deep, aging lines of his forehead. The acrid scent of raw fear entirely overpowered his expensive cedar cologne. "Listen to me. We can contain this exposure. We can make a discreet arrangement." He darted a panicked glance toward the regional director, then locked his bloodshot eyes back onto mine. "You command $30 billion, Winston whispered, his voice cracking. "You do not need to pursue this destructive path. I will surrender my shares. I will hand you the keys to the firm. Just retract the evidence. Withdraw the dossier from the table before the agents arrive. We are blood. We can forge a deal." I looked at the man who had called me trash mere minutes prior. I observed the terror stripping away his patriarchal mask, leaving a hollow, begging coward. He offered me a firm I had already conquered, utilizing biological ties he spent my entire life severing. I leaned forward, matching his physical proximity, and delivered the execution blow. "You are losing your grip, Winston," I stated evenly, my tone completely devoid of mercy. Winston flinched as if I had struck his jaw with a physical weapon. I straightened my spine, rising above his cowering frame. "You possess absolutely nothing to offer me," I continued. I projected my voice, ensuring the banking syndicates, the regional regulators, and the socialites lingering on the dance floor captured the final decree. "You spent the entire month begging an anonymous elite buyer for a capital injection. You sacrificed your pride, desperately courting a lifeline to save this sinking empire from your catastrophic commercial real estate failures." I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the dais, stretching the tension until it threatened to snap the crystal fixtures suspended overhead. Down on the main floor, Vivienne clutched her diamond choker, her eyes wide with animalistic terror, sensing the impending collapse of her social throne. "I am the anonymous buyer," I revealed. The regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission gasped audibly, covering his mouth with a linen napkin. Winston's eyes rolled back slightly. He swayed on his feet, the gravity of the revelation crushing his equilibrium. The savior he worshipped all month was the daughter he actively planned to imprison. "And I have officially denied your capital injection," I declared, driving the killing stroke through the heart of Belmont Capital. "I purchased the entirety of your toxic debt portfolio 48 hours ago through my proxy firms in Luxembourg. The promissory notes belong exclusively to me, and I am calling the leverage immediately." Winston gripped his chest. His mouth opened in a silent scream of total financial annihilation. Calling the debt triggered an avalanche of margin calls. It immediately seized the corporate accounts, froze the equity lines, and triggered the default clauses on his commercial properties. "Your firm is not merely exposed," I finalized, my voice a lethal, unyielding blade striking stone. "You are completely, instantly bankrupt. You possess zero liquidity, zero leverage, and absolutely zero escape." Winston opened his mouth. His jaw worked uselessly, muscles spasming as he desperately searched his fabricated reality for a lifeline, a loophole, or another lie to hurl against the monolithic truth of his bankruptcy. He drew a ragged breath, preparing to negotiate with the executioner. He never formed the first syllable. A thunderous, concussive crash shattered the fragile silence of the estate. The towering, solid oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom burst inward, striking the limestone walls with a violent, explosive impact that reverberated through the floorboards. The brass handles carved grooves into the plaster. Dozens of federal agents flooded the venue. They moved with terrifying, synchronized kinetic energy, forming a dark, impenetrable phalanx. They wore heavy, navy blue tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Kevlar armor, utility belts, and holstered sidearms replaced the sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer silk. Their heavy combat boots pounded against the polished marble, drowning out the ambient hum of the luxury gala. The intrusion shocked the Chicago financial elite into absolute, paralyzed silence. The orchestrators of corporate mergers and equity buyouts physically shrank away from the advancing tactical column. A waiter near the ice sculpture dropped a silver tray. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the floor, adding a sharp, chaotic percussion to the military march. The regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, seated beside me on the dais, immediately raised his hands, pushing his chair backward to distance himself entirely from the Belmont patriarchs. Federal agents secure the exits. Nobody moves. The lead agent commanded. His voice operated as a blunt instrument, cutting through the sprawling ballroom. He possessed a rigid, authoritative posture, his eyes scanning the crowd with sharp, tactical precision before locking onto the elevated VIP table. Winston collapsed back into his mahogany chair, the remaining blood drained from his extremities. He recognized the tactical strike force he had summoned. He mobilized this exact unit to arrest me, counting on their arrival to validate his pristine corporate reputation. He watched the agents march directly toward the dais, realizing his anonymous tip had successfully summoned the architects of his own demise. Dalton, however, snapped. The paralyzing shock of the $30 billion revelation evaporated, replaced by a blind, feral panic. His survival instincts hijacked his deteriorating cognitive functions. He executed a desperate, sloppy pivot, attempting to resurrect the original frame job right in front of the advancing federal squad. Dalton scrambled forward, his bespoke Italian loafers slipping wildly on the spilled champagne and broken glass littering the dais. He lunged toward the edge of the platform, thrusting a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "It is her!" Dalton shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. Spit flew from his lips, catching the fractured chandelier light. "Arrest her. She is the one you want. She is the compliance clerk. She forged the authorizations. She stole the $50 million from the escrow accounts." He turned his frantic gaze toward the lead agent, waving his arms in a chaotic, spastic rhythm. "She routed the pension funds to the Cayman Islands," Dalton continued, his chest heaving as he weaponized the exact details of his own treason against me. "I caught her. She hacked my terminal. Check the compliance logs. She orchestrated the entire corporate theft. You have to take her into custody right now." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to shout down his accusations. I did not take a single defensive step backward. Action-driven restraint remains the ultimate countermeasure to unhinged panic. I picked up the matte black titanium flash drive resting beside the heavy, color-coded forensic portfolio. I turned away from my hyperventilating brother. I stepped forward, descending the 3 shallow wooden stairs of the dais with fluid, unbothered grace. I walked directly into the path of the advancing federal strike force. The lead agent halted, holding up a clenched fist to pause his tactical column. He observed my approach, assessing the complete lack of fear in my posture. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. I raised my hand and extended the thick, leather-bound portfolio and the encrypted titanium drive. "Agent," I addressed him, my voice projecting a calm, clinical authority. "Inside this portfolio, you will find the complete, unredacted transaction matrices detailing the $50 million escrow hemorrhage at Belmont Capital. You will find the exact Internet protocol addresses and metadata matching the forged compliance signatures directly to Dalton Belmont's corner office terminal." Dalton choked on a gasp, his frantic accusations dying instantly in his throat. I tapped the matte black metal casing of the flash drive. This device contains the raw, time-stamped surveillance footage of Dalton executing the federal wire fraud. alongside the network logs proving Winston Belmont co-signed the secondary transfer nodes from his personal home router. The funds are currently secured within a blacklisted holding company in the Cayman Islands. Corporate registration number 87429-Alpha. The entire digital anatomy of their treason is indexed and verified. The lead agent did not immediately speak. He holstered his radio and accepted the heavy portfolio and the flash drive. He flipped open the leather cover, his eyes dropping to the physical documents. He scanned the first page. He registered the strict evidentiary formatting. He traced the crimson lines connecting the fraudulent Delaware clearinghouse transfers to the offshore accounts. He absorbed the geographical map of the felony, analyzing the flawless structural integrity of the intelligence dossier I placed directly into his hands. The agent closed the portfolio. He looked up, his gaze shifting from the documents to my face. The standard. Aggressive suspicion utilized by law enforcement evaporated. He offered a brief, firm, respectful nod. It was a silent, professional acknowledgement. He recognized the sheer magnitude of the forensic architecture I had constructed. I did not simply hand him a lead, I handed him a locked, sealed, and finalized federal indictment on a silver platter. The agent stepped past me. He ascended the stairs of the dais, his tactical boots crushing the shattered crystal underfoot. The armed squad followed, swarming the VIP table, forming an impenetrable perimeter around the Belmont patriarchs. Dalton stumbled backward, his shoulder blades hitting the heavy drapery lining the back wall. He raised his hands, trembling violently, attempting to shield his face from the inevitable strike. Winston remained seated. A hollowed-out shell staring blankly at the polished marble table, utterly destroyed by the collision of his bankruptcy and his impending incarceration. The lead agent stopped directly in front of the two men. He did not yell. He delivered the execution order with the absolute, crushing weight of the United States government. "Winston and Dalton Belmont," the agent declared, his voice echoing across the dead-silent ballroom. "You are under arrest for massive federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft." Two tactical officers surged forward. They grabbed Dalton by the lapels of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, hauling him away from the drapery. They spun him around with brutal, uncompromising force, slamming his chest against the polished surface of the VIP table. Dalton sobbed. A wet, guttural wail ripped from his throat as the officers wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists sliced through the heavy air. Another pair of agents hauled Winston out of his mahogany chair. The patriarch offered zero resistance. His legs failed entirely. The officers physically supported his weight as they pulled his arms behind his back. The second set of handcuffs snapped shut, the interlocking steel teeth grinding together, securing his hands. The dual metallic clicks reverberated across the ballroom, bouncing off the frescoed ceilings and rolling over the horrified crowd of Chicago socialites and financial elites. The sound operated as the ultimate, definitive punctuation mark concluding their reign of terror. I stood at the base of the dais, listening to the ratcheting steel, the coiled spring inside my chest completely unwound. The profound psychological tension I had carried for months evaporated into the frigid air rushing in from the broken ballroom doors. The absolute catharsis flooded my system. The apex predators were caged, bound by the very trap they had meticulously engineered for me. The tactical officers hauled Dalton off the polished marble. His bespoke Italian tuxedo, the garment he loudly claimed cost more than my annual rent, hung and ruined. Champagne-soaked tatters, shards of broken crystal clung to the midnight blue velvet, catching the fractured light of the chandeliers. He did not possess the stoic resilience of a criminal mastermind. He possessed the fragile, paper-thin spine of a spoiled, entitled, air-facing genuine consequence for the very first time in his 32 years of existence. He thrashed against the iron grips of the federal agents. His expensive Italian loafers scrambled for traction, leaving dark scuff marks across the pristine floor. Tears carved erratic tracks through the heavy sheen of sweat coating his face. The sheer unadulterated terror of a mandatory federal prison sentence annihilated his familial loyalty in a single heartbeat. "It was him!" Dalton shrieked. He wrenched his neck, jutting his chin toward Winston, who hung limply between two other armed agents. He orchestrated the entire transfer. He made me forge the compliance signatures. He threatened to cut my inheritance if I refused to drain the escrow trusts. Tell them. Winston, tell them you forced me to execute the fraud. Dalton sobbed hysterically, saliva flying from his lips as he actively offered his own father to the wolves to shave years off a federal indictment. The partnership built on stolen pension funds and aggressive arrogance dissolved into a pathetic, ugly display of self-preservation. Winston did not defend his son. The patriarch of Belmont Capital simply stared at the floor. The son he groomed, the heir he elevated above me, was screaming for his crucifixion. The ultimate aristocratic legacy Winston worshipped evaporated into the stifling air of the ballroom. His shoulders caved inward, his spine bowing under the catastrophic weight of his exposure. The imposing 62-year-old chief executive withered into a frail, defeated man facing the terminal end of his existence. The agents dragged Winston forward. His leather shoes scraped uselessly against the marble, offering zero resistance. The crowd of Chicago's elite, the hedge fund managers, the corporate litigators, the socialites who gladly drank his vintage champagne minutes prior, watched the procession in absolute, horrified silence. No one offered a character reference. No one stepped forward to block the federal strike force. The parasitic society immediately severed their ties with the infected host. I turned my attention away from the dais. I scanned the perimeter of the ballroom, mapping the chaotic, fearful movements of the guests. Near the towering ice sculpture, a flash of crimson silk caught my eye. Vivienne abandoned her sycophantic friends. She dropped her crystal flute onto a passing waiter's tray and turned her back on the federal raid. She moved with rapid, desperate strides, navigating the shadows along the draped velvet curtains, heading straight for the secondary service doors flanking the catering kitchen. She sought to preserve her platinum bracelets, her diamond choker, and her imported luxury vehicles. She intended to vanish into the frigid night before the authorities froze the marital estate. I bypassed the stunned regulators on the dais. I descended the wooden stairs and moved across the marble floor, intercepting her trajectory with calculated, mathematical precision. I stepped directly into her path, blocking the service corridor. Vivienne halted, her heels skidding slightly against the stone. She glared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic, the cruel, mocking socialite who intentionally spilled coffee on my keyboard and publicly insulted my simple navy dress attempted to summon her former, fabricated authority. "Move out of my way, Brielle," Vivienne hissed, her eyes darting frantically over my shoulder toward the federal agents securing the main entrance. "I am leaving. Your petty family drama has nothing to do with me." I did not yield a single inch. I looked at the diamond choker gripping her throat. I looked at the heavy silk pooling around her legs. "You are not leaving, Vivienne," I stated, my voice devoid of any inflection, cutting through her panic like a scalpel. "And this is not a family drama. This is a corporate liquidation," she scoffed, a brittle, panicked sound. "My assets are legally separate. Dalton's mistakes do not impact my private accounts. Now step aside before I have security remove you." I tilted my head, offering her a cold, calculated stare. "You severely misunderstand the mechanics of a hostile takeover. When I purchased Belmont Capital's toxic debt 48 hours ago, I triggered the cross-collateralization clauses embedded in your husband's executive contracts. You financed your opulent lifestyle using corporate credit lines backed by the firm's equity." Vivienne's bravado faltered. Her manicured fingers twitched, gripping the brass clasp of her designer clutch. "The exact second my $30 billion acquisition cleared," I continued, driving the blade deeper, "I authorized my banking executives to seize the collateral. The marital estate is frozen. The luxury vehicles are impounded. The platinum cards resting in your purse currently carry zero liquidity." "You are lying," she whispered, her voice cracking, completely lacking conviction. I gestured toward the heavy silk clutch gripped in her left hand. "Check your application. Verify the ledger." Vivian's hands shook violently. She fumbled with the clasp of her purse, extracting a sleek smartphone. She bypassed her biometric lock, tapping frantically to open her primary banking portal. I watched the reflection of the screen illuminate her pale, terrified face. The application loaded. It rendered her checking balances, her savings trusts, and her premium credit lines. The digital numbers plummeted. The screen refreshed, pulling the real-time data from the servers I now completely controlled. The massive, seven-figure balances evaporated instantly, replaced entirely by a column of stark, hollow zeros. Bright red banners indicating severe account locks and active asset seizures flashed across the top of her display. Vivienne gasped, her fingers going numb. The phone slipped from her grasp. It clattered against the marble floor, the screen fracturing upon impact. She sank against the limestone wall, sliding down until her knees hit the ground. The heavy crimson silk pooled around her trembling frame. The diamond choker and platinum bracelets no longer functioned as symbols of elite status. They transformed into heavy, visible shackles tying her to a bankrupt federal criminal. I turned my back on her weeping form. I walked back toward the center of the ballroom. The socialites who previously laughed at her cruel jokes, the executives who actively ignored my existence, they tracked my approach. As I stepped forward, the crowd parted. They scrambled backward, physically distancing themselves from my path. The men in bespoke suits bumped into one another, clearing a wide, unobstructed corridor for my passage. They looked at my simple, unadorned navy dress and saw the impenetrable armor of an apex predator. The mockery and contempt that filled the room an hour prior dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror and awe. They recognized the supreme, untouchable authority radiating from my posture. I did not require their validation. I owned their entire ecosystem, and I possessed the ruthless capability to dismantle any opponent who crossed my boundaries. At the front of the hall, the lead federal agent signaled to his tactical squad. "Move them out!" The agents marched Winston and Dalton toward the main entrance. The heavy oak doors remained pinned wide open against the plaster walls. Outside, the freezing Chicago wind whipped across the grand limestone portico, carrying the sharp sting of winter directly into the stifling heat of the gala. A dozen federal vehicles idled in the sweeping gravel driveway. The blinding red and blue strobe lights from the tactical cruisers pierced the darkness, spilling directly into the grand ballroom. The violently flashing colors washed over the towering crystal chandeliers, painting the imported marble floors with the unmistakable hues of law enforcement. Dalton wailed as the agents shoved him through the doors and into the biting cold. The freezing air struck his ruined, tear-stained face. He stumbled toward the armored transport van, a broken, disgraced felon entirely stripped of his unearned supremacy, sobbing uncontrollably as the tactical officers forced his head down and pushed him into the steel cage. Winston followed, his head bowed, his chin resting securely against his chest. The flashing police lights illuminated his pale, withered features in erratic bursts of red and blue. The patriarch marched past the towering ice swan he commissioned to celebrate his triumph. He stepped out of his luxury estate, flanked by heavily armed agents, and vanished into the back of a federal transport vehicle. I stood in the center of the devastated ballroom, listening to the heavy metal doors of the transport vans slam shut. Their execution was public, permanent, and entirely self-inflicted by their own towering arrogance. They built a spectacular, expensive stage to orchestrate my destruction. Entirely unaware, they constructed the gallows for their own hanging. The illusion of their aristocratic superiority lay in shattered, irreparable pieces across the floor, completely obliterated by the silent compliance clerk they thought they could break. The brutal, freezing winter of 2026 eventually thawed, yielding to the driving rains and renewing winds of the spring of 2027. The seasons shifted, and the financial landscape of Chicago altered irreversibly alongside them. Belmont Capital ceased to exist. I did not allow the firm to restructure under a new banner. I did not permit the board of directors to salvage the remaining client lists. I authorized the immediate, total liquidation of the physical and digital assets, liquidation contractors descended upon the corporate headquarters. They unbolted the heavy mahogany desks from the floorboards. They stripped the imported leather seating from the executive suites. Workers wielded sharp metal scrapers, peeling the gold-leaf Belmont crest off the heavy frosted glass doors, erasing the patriarchal legacy, letter by letter. The silver Bentley Winston proudly paraded around the financial district hit the auction block, repossessed to satisfy a fraction of the toxic debt he accumulated. The towering limestone estate that hosted the fateful Christmas Eve gala fractured into partitioned parcels, sold to overseas developers. The empire completely evaporated into the financial ether, leaving absolutely zero trace of its former supremacy. Winston and Dalton did not witness the physical dismantling of their kingdom. The federal justice system moves with a grinding, mechanical efficiency when presented with an airtight, unredacted intelligence dossier during the sentencing hearings. Their high-priced defense attorneys slammed into an impenetrable brick wall of metadata, forged compliance signatures, and offshore routing codes. The federal judge struck the wooden gavel against the sound block, stripping away their unearned aristocratic armor in a matter of seconds. Winston and Dalton are currently serving 15-year mandatory minimum sentences. They reside inside the reinforced concrete walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. Their daily reality presents a violent contrast to the curated luxury they previously demanded. Rough, bright orange cotton jumpsuits replace their bespoke Milanese silk and cashmere tuxedos. Cheap, slip-on canvas shoes replace their polished Italian loafers. Dalton wakes at 6 o'clock every morning to a harsh, blaring siren. The arrogant vice president who previously hurled quarterly reports at my head now scrubs metal cafeteria trays, trading his unearned corporate supremacy for the grueling, repetitive labor of institutional confinement. He weeps in his cell, his fragile ego entirely shattered by the brutal hierarchy of the prison yard. Winston absorbs a different variant of psychological torment. The patriarch, who obsessed over his pristine public image, now sits in a windowless common room, staring blankly at a cinder-block wall. He possesses zero authority. He commands zero respect. He lost his wealth, his freedom, and his name. He will spend the next 15 years grappling with the agonizing truth that his own towering arrogance engineered his absolute destruction. Vivienne avoided federal indictment, but she did not escape the catastrophic blast radius of the hostile takeover. The immediate freezing of the corporate credit lines and the seizure of the marital estate plunged her directly into the unforgiving reality of the working class. She punches a mechanical time clock at 6 in the morning. She works a minimum wage retail job at a luxury department store positioned on the Magnificent Mile. The woman who once clattered her platinum bracelets and mocked my off-the-rack navy dress now spends 8 hours a day on her feet, wearing a polyester uniform. She steams the heavy silk gowns she previously purchased without checking the price tags. She kneels on the carpeted floor, organizing the designer shoes she used to hoard. Her ultimate punishment arrives through the revolving glass doors of the boutique. The elite socialites she once ruled over frequent the store. They walk past her, tossing their discarded garments over her arm, treating her with the exact aristocratic disdain she formerly weaponized against me. They refuse to make eye contact. They demand she fetch different sizes, snapping their manicured fingers to summon her attention. Vivienne bites her tongue, swallows her pride, and fetches the garments. She serves the very society that exiled her, trapped in a purgatory of her own making. I no longer ride the crowded transit trains. I no longer wear faded wool cardigans or organize tedious compliance forms in a windowless cubicle. I stand at the apex of a towering glass skyscraper dominating the Chicago skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer an unobstructed, panoramic view of the financial district. I walk across the polished obsidian floor of the master boardroom. The $30 billion backing my algorithmic trading empire no longer rests in the shadows. I shattered the anonymous proxy barriers. I stepped fully into the light. I direct my global executives in the open. I authorize massive equity acquisitions across London, Zurich, and Tokyo. I sit at the head of the heavy conference table, projecting lethal, untouchable authority. I do not hide my intellect. I do not shrink my posture to accommodate the fragile egos of incompetent men. I control the board. I dictate the market. I govern my existence with absolute, unyielding autonomy. The overarching narrative of this journey illuminates a profound truth. Your inherent self-worth is never dictated by the toxic people who refuse to see it. We often encounter individuals who view our quiet demeanor as an invitation for exploitation. They weaponize their titles, their leased luxury cars, and their loud voices to project a manufactured superiority. They attempt to cage us, belittle our achievements, and demand our silent compliance to fuel their own narcissistic delusions. When arrogant individuals mistake your quiet endurance for weakness, they inevitably dig their own graves. True power does not require a loud voice or a designer label. It does not demand the public mockery of others to validate its existence. True power requires deep competence. It requires unshakable integrity. It demands the sheer, unapologetic courage to stop shrinking yourself to fit into rooms where you are not respected. You possess the capability to map your own exit. You hold the intellectual capital to build your own empire. Independent of the parasites who attempt to drain your resources, do not hand them your reaction. Do not engage in their petty, chaotic skirmishes. Observe their maneuvers, secure your leverage, and wait for the precise moment to detonate the reality they so arrogantly constructed. If you enjoyed this story and believe in taking back your power, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and stay strong. Goodbye.